Hello, this is Brad for an early morning takeoff from Ontario, California in the JAR A320. The main purpose of this video is to demonstrate takeoff and then transition to managed flight. I will do a perfunctory cold and dark startup and a programming of the FMGC, but the focus of the video will be taking off and initial climb. One more note, especially about this video, is I like flying in the early morning or late in the day because my own computer can't keep up with rendering lots of daytime eye candy. I apologize for the darkness of the screen, so be sure to turn up your brightness. We will start by fueling the aircraft. I've already been to fuelplanner.com and know what fuel I'm going to need to get from Ontario to San Jose, California. And we want to do this before we get any systems going to prevent any accidents. There's our fuel truck pulling up, and now we'll just wait for the fuel panel to appear. We need at least 6,000 kilograms, so it looks like we're just fine. We can go ahead and dismiss the fueler. Next, we'll close the doors, and then we can begin our startup at the overhead panel. To get power to the aircraft, we turn on battery 1 and 2. Once the batteries are on, we can turn on our APU master and then hit the start button. I also like to turn up the overhead lights so that when the APUs are up to speed, we'll get a good visual indication. And to throw back to my old private pilot days, I always like to turn on the beacon to let people know that we're home and in the cockpit. Next, let's get everybody seated with the seatbelt sign and of course no smoking sign. Then arm our emergency lights. Then a quick check of our electrical pump to make sure it's on, and then over to align the ADIRUs. ADIRU stands for Air Data Inertial Navigation Unit and is responsible for keeping track of the aircraft's position relative to the position that it aligns with here. Through a series of linear accelerometers and laser gyroscopes, your aircraft's attitude, altitude, location, speed, and other conditions are calculated against this alignment and the rotation of the Earth where it's needed. We start by setting the data switch to status or STS, and then the system switch to any one of the 3 ADIRUs. All 3 will be updated simultaneously anyway. Then turn the 3 CDU mode switches to nav. Momentarily in the status window you will be prompted to enter the position. So simply press enter on the keyboard in this case. This begins the alignment process. Its status or TTN, time to navigation, begins counting down in the status window, in this case 7 minutes. Now we'll take care of one of the more annoying aspects of the JAR A320. We need to adjust the temperature knobs. Centering them seems to be about right. Strangely, they are always in some bizarre position when you load this aircraft. That's the annoying part. Next, we turn on the APU bleed and the packs so that we can get some cooling in the aircraft. And also it's necessary to have the APU bleed running in order to start the engines, which I have found out the hard way. Down on the pedestal, we'll turn on our radio stack and then the INTEG lights for our instruments. Notice our displays. The PDF and the ND are still awaiting for the alignment to finish. So we're just going to have to wait a few seconds for those to clear. Okay, now we can get to the business of programming the FMGC. via its interface, the MCDU. First thing I check is my air rack cycle to make sure I have the most recent one, which happens to be 1504 at the making of this video. We start the process by clicking on the init key. By the way, normally I do this on my iPad using the AirFMS application, but today I'm using the mouse so that you can see exactly what it is I'm doing. First we enter the airport of origin, / and destination airport in the scratch pad, and set it by pressing the R1 button. When you click Align IRS, you are basically syncing the FMGC with the alignment data from the ADARU above. Next, the fictitious flight number, which is helpful if you're using one of the online ATC services. And to avoid getting an altitude error later, I'm going to skip cost index and cruise flight level until after I've entered my flight plan. On the flight plan screen, we'll start with our departure at Ontario. We'll click the L1 button twice to bring up our options for departure. We will be departing runway 8 right this morning as the winds are coming out of the east, and we'll be using the Pomona 7 SID and transitioning or leaving the SID at the Avenal VOR. We insert all this by pressing the R6 key. This takes us back to the flight plan screen where we continue by pressing L6 for our destination. This brings up the arrival screen for San Jose. Again, the wind is out of the east, which can actually happen in the mornings at San Jose. So let's enter ILS 12 right. We'll be using a recently added star called Silicon 1, apropos for San Jose. There is no other transition on the left side of the screen, so we click No Via. However, because of one of the several bugs in the JAR FMGC, we skip the normal transition at TROX and just click to insert. In one of my other videos on programming this FMGC, I demonstrate what happens if you do select a transition like TROX. You end up with a really squirrely route that makes absolutely no sense. Normally I step through my route on the ND just to double check that all the waypoints are in. So I'll head back to the init screen and enter my cost index and cruise altitude. There's been some confusion about what the cost index really is. Very simply, it's a factor derived from the cost of time divided by the cost of fuel, and it's used by the airline to determine climb and descent rates and cruise speeds. It basically determines how economical a flight will be. The lower the number, the greater the economy. In my research, most cost index charts for the A320 give a medium cost index of around 45, which is what we will use here. Interestingly enough, its effect is simulated in this aircraft, so it's important that you do set it. Okay, moving on. Pressing the right cursor button brings up our fuel screen, where we simply fill in the red rectangles by clicking R1 and R2. Finally, over to our takeoff performance screen. On this page there are a number of things that need to be set. We start by simply filling in the V speeds on the left by pressing R1, 2, and 3. Next is our transition altitude. This is the altitude during ascent when the pilot sets the altimeter to the region's standard baro, or barometric pressure. In the US, this is typically flight level 180, but in other places like Europe it can be as low as 5,000 feet. The default for the JAR A320 is 5,000 feet, so it does need to be changed each time you are flying in the US, to the 18,000. The two other altitudes directly below the transition altitude indicate where the thrust levers are reduced after takeoff, and then where maximum climb speed begins. I usually leave these at the default set by the FMGC. Of course, you can change them. The flaps and the THS are optional and supposedly for information only. The former is simply the flap's position for takeoff, and the latter, the degree to which the horizontal stabilizer is trimmed before takeoff. Interestingly, even though it's just for show, the trim wheels still spin after setting this in the JAR A320. The flex setting is supposed to be optional, but I've found that you will get a master error if you don't set it. A lot of times this is already set for you, and I haven't really determined why it's in there sometimes and why you have to set it other times. But basically, flex settings are additional ways to economize on takeoff, taking into account lower thrust requirements for longer runways. I normally leave the takeoff shift or TO shift blank because this is also optional. For your information, this is the offset from the end of the runway before you begin your takeoff roll. It's apparently to compensate for a change in your position if you're taking off further down the runway, maybe from an intersection. The engine start process begins by turning on all 6 of the fuel pumps on the overhead panel. And then rotating the engine mode switch to start down on our pedestal, and then flipping the start switches for each engine forward. You can stagger it so that each engine has time to come up to speed by watching the ECAM. And I've read that it's recommended you start engine 2 first, but I've never seen it make much of a difference in this simulator.
Starting engine 2.
After the engines are started, you can return the engine mode switch to normal and then begin to prepare the aircraft for taxi. I'll turn on some more lights for taxiing and recognition. And now that the engines are running, we can power down the APU. And finally set the flaps to 2 and arm the spoilers.
Flaps 1. Flaps 2. Spoilers arm.
The last thing before taxiing, I will set my initial altitude on the FCU. I'll use 5,000 feet for this airport. So when we reach 5,000 feet, we'll wait for clearance from ATC to continue to the next assigned altitude. I'll also reduce the range of our navigational display to 10 miles on the EFIS. The park brake comes off and we apply a little power.
Park brake off.
When the seatbelt sign illuminates, you must fasten your seatbelt. Insert the metal fittings one into the other and tighten by pulling on the loose end of the strap. To release your seatbelt, let the upper portion of it buckle. There are several emergency exits on this.
As we taxi to the runway, we can see the beautiful San Gabriel Mountains to the north.
Take a few moments now to
Again, I like to fly early in the morning or late at night.
the air pressure
X-plane renders those conditions beautifully.
An oxygen mask will automatically appear in front of you.
Anyway, here we are at the end of the runway with a few more things to do before we are cleared for takeoff. First, I checked my initial altitude setting of 5,000 feet. I've also dialed in a speed restriction of 178 knots. This might need a little explanation. One of the things that was very disconcerting about the JAR A320 was when I was first learning to fly it and noticed how precipitously the nose drops after takeoff if you just engage the autopilot with no restrictions. The speed bug on the PFD zooms up to the max climb speed of 250 knots, which is the legal limit below 10,000 feet, but in order for the airplane to achieve that speed, the nose must indeed come down. So I did a little research and found that the proper takeoff profile calls for an initial climb speed of V2 plus between 10 and 20 knots. Up on the EFIS, I double-checked the range of my navigational display to 10 miles. And on the center pedestal, I'll make sure the engine mode switch is set to normal. Then back to the overhead panel, I turn off my packs at least temporarily and turn on my strobe lights and finally my landing lights. Down on my instrument panel, I check that I have set the auto brake to max just in case there are any issues on takeoff. So we are cleared for takeoff and we head out to the runway.
Brake off.
Today we'll be doing the recommended rolling takeoff, so I won't stop. But before things get too busy, I'll turn on my chronograph. It's important to get the aircraft straight and on the center line before we push the stick slightly forward and slowly apply power, which we do so until we see our flex number on the FMA. Sometimes the co-pilot will say power set and then wait for the co-pilot to call out 100 knots. When the co-pilot calls out rotate, I pull the stick back to 10 degrees angle,
V1,
as
rotate.
indicated on the flight director. If you pull back too fast, you could get a tail strike at
Positive
14
climb.
degrees. I raise the gear
Gear up.
when I see the vertical speed needle on the right side of
Spoilers
the
disarm.
PFD begin to move up, or I hear the co-pilot announce positive rate. I quickly set the heading knob to our runway heading so that once I engage the autopilot, I can
Autopilot
maintain
1,
straight
cross-check.
flight until I'm in control and ready to start my lateral
Speed
navigation.
checked. Flaps 1.
When I'm comfortable that everything is going smoothly, I increase the speed, which then means I can decrease the flaps a notch. And I'm
Speed
also
check.
keeping an eye
Flaps
on the
0.
FMA for the lever climb indicator to flash, which means I need to reduce power. When I'm satisfied everything is set properly, I click the heading knob to begin my managed lateral navigation. And now the lever climb is flashing, so I reduce power. And notice that it now shows speed on the FMA. We are now at 5,000 feet, and in anticipation of clearance to my final cruise altitude, I'll dial in 30,000. Okay, ATC has just cleared us for our cruise altitude, so first I click the speed knob to put the aircraft in managed speed mode, which will raise it to 250 knots, and then I click the altitude selector to begin our climb. And this is where I will leave off in this demo. You can watch the completion of a flight like this in another video I have called KONT to KSJC. Thanks for watching, and be sure to leave your comments and suggestions and fill in the gaps where I have missed something. I'm always willing to learn more.